Welcome to the RI Philosophy and Technology Research Seminars. Today we're lucky to have Nicklas Lundblad from Google, who will address a topic that Google and he himself have quite an interest in, which is not necessarily the amount of information that we want to have, but other issues that are got to do with the lack of information and uncertainty therefore. There will be a question and answer section afterwards, but will not be part of this recording. Thank you. Nicklas, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great opportunity to step outside of your daily role and sort of reflect on a couple of things that have come up over the years as I've been working at Google. I've been at Google since 2007 and been first working in the Nordics, building our public policy and government relations business there. Prior to that, I completed my PhD in informatics on noise societies and what happens in information abundance situations. And after having worked 2 years for Google in the Nordics, I went over to Mountain View to build something we called our Central Public Policy team, which is essentially a strategy and research team. And I stayed there for 3.5 years. It was lovely in many ways. And then I wanted to move back because I wanted my kids to go to Swedish school. And I came back, and since November last year, I'm heading up our European Public Policy and Government Relations organization. Now, that said, I'm going to give you the mother of all disclaimers here. I have an ongoing bet with the lawyers about, who can write the best disclaimers. And so this is my entry into the competition. My views are only mine and not those of any other entity, being, organization, or company. And I mean that because, as I said in the beginning, having the opportunity to sort of step out of your daily role also means that I'm not going to be able to voice company opinions or sort of give you company views on everything, because the company simply doesn't have views on everything. Now, if you're interested in those views, as I said, I'm more than happy to discuss where the company has views, but the particular presentation I'm going to give you is not going to be a corporate line, as is also accented by, articulated by the fact that there's no nice logo anywhere. I actually don't like logos on pre-sales. The subject for today is this, an ethics of ignorance. And I am going to walk you through a couple of thoughts, some of them more formed than others, and essentially ask the question, do we need an ethics of ignorance? And is that something that's actually propped up in the last several years because of what's happened in technology and what's happened in information and what's happened in data growth? And that's something I want to discuss, and I'm going to discuss it from a couple of different points. The first thing I want to do is to just give you the starting point, how this came up. As all good things, it came up in a dinner conversation. And this dinner conversation was about me happily declaring that I had done this. Do you recognize what this is? You know what this is? This is 23andMe. So 23andMe is, a full disclosure, we own a part of the company as Google. 23andMe is a gene sequencing company. And what it does is it sequences your genome, gives you back health risks, and gives you back a sense of where you have elevated risk according to medical studies and where you don't. So you can see here that I'm going to die of coronary heart disease, prostate cancer, I'm going to get that thromboembolism, restless leg syndrome. I really didn't know what this was until they told me that I had an elevated risk for it, and ulcerative colitis, and oh boy, that's bad, don't Google that. So I was really enthusiastic about this. I thought it was fantastic in many different ways, partly because I'm a geek, and so the question came up during dinner, would you do it? And I was amazed by the polarity of the responses. They were extremely polarized. Some people were like me, like, yes, of course we do it. Yes, Other people were more along the lines of, I would never ever do that in my life, even if I, was forced and dragged into a room in my genome sequence. It's really extremely polarized opinions. And I found that very, very interesting. As I wanted to start digging in why that was. What is the benefit of knowing? And I can sort of think about a couple of benefits for me, at least. I know I should be eating more healthy food, and I know that there are a couple of things I can do in order to sort of have more health. And generally, when you look at the benefit of knowing as a concept, there are always things we can do. We can adapt our actions. We can adapt how we interact with the world if we know something. And then against this, of course, you have the cost of knowledge. What does it cost us to acquire this knowledge? That's the other part of the equation. Now, the interesting thing is that for sequencing the genome and for a lot of other things, the cost of knowledge, and this is an overall trend in society, is sinking rapidly. Now, the cost for sequencing your genome is $99. That's it. You don't need to pay any more than that, and it's $99. Now, here's an interesting thing that sort of propped up during my dinner conversations, and that really got me thinking that there's more to this than just, you know, an initial Luddite reaction to new technology, which I mistakenly first thought. Now, the cost of knowledge is not equal to the cost of knowing. This is interesting, because it turns out that if you know something about your future, if you know something will happen, or if you know any particular fact that is in some way hurtful to you, then that will affect everything you do after you internalize that fact. Now, it was a Brit who came up with what is actually the origin of what you do not know will not hurt you. It's George Petty, who wrote a series of romance novels adapted for the gentle woman, as it said in 1556. I think this was published. So long as I know it not, it hurteth me not. And this seems to be a general sense that I found in a lot of the people I discussed this with. They preferred not to know, because the cost of knowing that they could have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or something like that was simply too high to them, even if the cost of knowledge was really low. And then, of course, it's a question of others knowing. There were some people who said that, well, I don't want my genetic data articulated in a way that's actually shareable, because then, you know, somebody else may get it, and it may end up there. Looking at this, I thought it's interesting that that we have such a dual way to look at knowledge. Everybody praises knowledge when we talk about it in politics, when we talk about it in society at large. But if you look at the human history, our relationship to knowledge is kind of checkered. I mean, we have been thinking about knowledge in several different ways. It starts within the Christian tradition, of course. You know, you have the Lord said, God. The Lord God said, behold, the man is become one of us, to know good and evil, because he ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge. The consequence of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge is you're expelled from paradise. You're not allowed to be there anymore. That's an interesting basis for a religion. And, you know, that's kind of something we find with the Greeks as well. This man, who seemed to be a benefactor of all humankind, that beneath the earth, those hidden blessings, as Aeschylus writes, for man, bronze, iron, silver, and gold, who can claim to have discovered before me? No one, I am sure, who wants to speak to the purpose. In one short sentence, understand it all. Every art of mankind comes from Prometheus. And Prometheus gave every art of mankind to mankind because his brother had sort of wasted it all. Epimetheus forgot to keep something for humanity when he handed out gifts to all of the animals. So Prometheus then had to steal those gifts and give them to humanity. And what is he rewarded with? This. The guy has his liver picked out by a bird, repeatedly, every day, because Zeus was really pissed off with him when he gave all these good things to humanity. Seems as if we have this dual relationship with knowledge. And you find it everywhere, and you even find it in the history of philosophy generally. I mean, if you calculated this today, you wouldn't necessarily be in any way controversial in your knowledge. The square root of 2, it's an irrational number. We know this, right? Discovering an irrational number, however, is not entirely free of risk, as this man can attest to. This is Hippasus. Hippasus was one of the disciples of Pythagoras. And he found out that the square root of 2 is irrational. And according to legend and Apocrypha, Pythagoras said, well, very good, meet me tonight, we'll take a little ride on the lake. And they dumped him into the lake and he drowned. So it seems as if this thing, knowledge, that we kind of like, we kind of also think upsets power structures. It sort of goes both ways. It does two things for us. And how do we view knowledge now? What's been the development since? I think the best answer to that question is actually written by this brilliant man. I don't know if you know who this is, but this is Carlo Ginzburg. He's known to sort of have founded the entire field of microhistory, more or less. And he wrote this fantastic essay called Knowledge of High and Low, in which he explores the phrase, don't seek to know the higher things that you can find in the Bible. Originally, this phrase was meant, do not be high-minded. That means you should not be proud, you should not sort of be full of yourself, essentially. But it changed over time in the medieval ages into becoming this statement, do not seek to know the higher things. And already with St. Ambrosius, we find a really interesting statement that seems to echo those of my dinner colleagues. It is better to fear the things to come than to know them. In fact, it has been written, noli altus appear, do not seek to know the higher things. This is something that Ginzburg shows recurs through medieval history again and again and again, Altum sapere periculosum, it's really dangerous to know the higher things, and it's exemplified with Icarus, who tried to know the higher things, who tried to invent, who tried to innovate. And what happened? Well, you know, the sun burnt his wings off and he fell to the ground and died. Medieval ages knowledge, not so positive. So we move on then, and what happens is a kind of revolution with Enlightenment and Kant. Kant made his motto, sapere aude, dare to know. And it is generally argued, although I would take issue with this, that since Enlightenment, our relationship with knowledge has been that we believe that it's always worthwhile to know. I think that's not true. I think there's a huge medieval strain still left that sort of whispers in our ear, noli altis sapere. Do not seek to know the higher things. And I think that there's a really interesting conflict there, and I think that conflict is coming to a head with modern technology. So I'll speak a little bit about that. Now, for our times, technical change is what's driving, I think, the relationship between do not seek to know higher things and dare to know, the tension between the two. And at least three trends are quite clear if you look at them. The first one, of course, is fast data growth. The enormous amounts of data that are being produced every day are just stunning. I mean, the most conservative assessment of how fast data is growing gives a doubling rate of 18 months. When you think about that, a doubling rate, a doubling of human constructed or machine constructed data stored every 18 months. Means that in 18 months there will be double the amount of data out there what there is today. For a search engine, that's quite interesting, by the way, because it shows something really interesting about search. If you do nothing and you assume that quality is related to the data sets you have to examine, a search engine gets half as good in 18 months. So you have to throw lots of engineers on the problem of just running fast enough to stay in one place. It's essentially a Red Queen problem. Now, the other thing that's happening is widening data scope. Not only are we getting more data of the same kind, we're also getting new kinds of data. So the most important development here, and the most underestimated I find, especially if you look at policy circles and you look at what's happening generally, is the growth of sensors. Every single mobile phone today is filled with sensors. There's a lot of them. And the price of sensors plummeting faster than the price of computing. That again, if you think about it, is a really interesting relationship. The price of sensors is falling a lot faster than the price of computing. So that's another technical trend that is sure to not only give us more data, but a broader scope of data. And on top of that, we have advancing machine intelligence. We're getting better and better at using data with algorithms to mine patterns, to find correlations, to try to sort out what kinds of knowledge can exist in this growing cloud of noise. And one simple example of this is solving the problem of self-driving cars, but there are many others that don't necessarily relate to Google, where you can see how advancing machine intelligence helps us make sense of enormous amounts of data. So I think it's fair to say that our potential knowledge, what we could find out if we just wanted to, you know, what is really within the reach of our inquiring minds, grows very quickly. And the question then is, do we dare to know? Now, the challenge that we have to figure out when it comes to an ethics of ignorance can be formulated in two different ways. Either a strong formulation, I think, which is essentially, you know, this is the strong hypothesis of why we need an ethics for ignorance, and it would be something like, we have reached a point as a society where almost all knowledge is accessible at low or no cost. The question now is what we believe it is morally defensible to know, not just what we can find out. And the correlate to that is that knowledge now is a choice. It's no longer, you know, something that we need to say we can't know. There are no absolute stops from us from knowing something. We also have a weak formulation of the same hypothesis, and we can say this: there are now more things than ever that we could find out that we may not want to know. Just sort of a more modest way of putting it. And the question then becomes, how do we decide what we know and what we remain ignorant of? If we want to dive into a very simplistic informal analysis, and it is simplistic, believe me, we can assume a universe of facts and call that W, and we can say that our knowledge of this universe of facts essentially is, you know, what set of facts we know are in W and what set of facts we can't say whether or not they are in W. Now, question number one becomes, is there a subset of knowledge in this universe of facts consisting of that knowing it would be undesirable or ethically wrong? question number 2, if so, how do we determine that subset? That's another question that an ethics of ignorance has to answer, right? So I will give you 3 cases and 3 different ways of determining that subset that exist today. 3 existing cases I think are interesting to think about. These 3 cases essentially can be used to outline an ethics of ignorance, and I'm not saying that this is the way it should be done, but it gives you sort of an idea of where to start. Case number 1 is a project that the Swedish Medical Institute, Karolinska Institute, ran, called LifeGene. Have you heard of LifeGene? Do you know this product? No. It's a fairly large project in the medical world. What LifeGene does essentially is that it collects from more than 500,000 Swedish citizens as much genomic data as possible, and then it's trying to create a reference set that anybody who's interested in studying genomic data could use and work from. Now, what they say about their project is that what distinguishes it is that it goes several steps further than the current collections of samples that are limited to specific geographical regions, or are limited by size. Modern bioinformatics and state-of-the-art biobanking will be applied in the project. What they're doing is that they're essentially trying to build a reference set that can be used for any research that you want to do that has a genomic component. Swedish Data Protection Authority said, no, that's not happening. We're not doing that, and they closed the project down. Why? Because they said the purpose specification is too vague. You cannot collect data and say that you will use it as a reference set for all genomic research or as a component of genomic research. That's what current privacy law says. So, what we reach here is an answer to our question. How do we determine the subset? Well, you can say that one way of determining the subset, one way of sort of thinking about an ethics of ignorance that we see in this particular case is to say that there are subsets of knowledge in our universe of facts that are simply wrong because of the procedure you use to arrive at them. It means that we have a procedural criterion. How you know something can actually make what you know wrong. Case number 2 is another, I'm going to pick examples from Swedish law because those are the examples that are closest to me, but I think they're sort of applicable to other legislation as well. It's a research ban. And so the research ban in this case is very simple. Anyone working for the public authorities in Sweden has a right to tell the press about anything they want. You could say it's kind of a whistleblower provision, right? What if they then do that and something comes out in the press and there's a scandal, there exists a very strong rule and a very strong presumption, and you find this in other legal systems as well, that states that it's prohibited for the public authorities to research, to try to find out who disclosed information to the press. So there's an absolute prohibition. It's even criminalized, which means that you're not allowed to go and ask, every single employee, line them up, or outside the Director General's office, did you talk to the press? You're not allowed to even try to find this out. Now, this gives us another possible grounds for constructing an ethics of ignorance, right? You could say there's a subset K in our universe of facts that is not desirable for certain subjects to attempt to find out. So it's a subjective criteria. Who is trying to know actually determines if knowledge or ignorance are the right way to go. And then we have case number 3, which is, there are many different examples that you can give case number 3, but I thought that one of the interesting ones that have been discussed in the European Union recently is fetal diagnostics. And trying to figure out, by looking at fetuses in different ways, if you can predict their IQ later, if you can predict other things about them, or if you can predict, if they will be successful at certain sports, etc. That's something that the enormous data sets that are available actually can help you do, and you can look at gender, disease, you can look at IQ, all those things. To take a less controversial example, because fetal diagnostics certainly is controversial, by looking at certain data sets, you can determine all kinds of things that you that are sort of novel and not necessarily related to the reason that the data was acquired. And American company Jetpack recently in New York Times had a very interesting example where they said that they can actually predict what parts of a town are most hipster. So they can go to any part of a town and they can say this part of town is really hipster, if you want to go there you can go. And how do they do that? Well, they analyze all uploaded photos and look for beards. It's quite brilliant, isn't it? So you can imagine, except for the fact that
no ties.
No ties. Sorry about this. Yes. So you can imagine this then, which is kind of obvious, that there could be a subsetting case such that it's materially undesirable to find out, which means that our objective criteria is the nature of the knowledge that we're trying to find out, the very nature of it. So our criteria for ignorance could be who, there could be how, who, or what. And we can imagine that in an ethics of ignorance, as we start to flesh that out and we start to think about it, our guiding question would be who found out what, how. Now, a couple of conclusions on this as well that I think are interesting and tentative and that we can discuss is that it seems to me that willful ignorance is a moral choice, as well as trying to know something is a moral choice. Saying that we will not find this out is an important object of it's essentially a moral decision. I think another conclusion that we can agree on is that technology has enabled us to find out more things than we may want to know, and that's a discussion that we should be having. I agree with that. And then we need a way to start sketching out an ethics of ignorance, deciding when something is morally defensible to know or not. I also wanted to this is a workshop, I wanted to sort of highlight a few of the notes I have made on what I think is wrong in this argument and what I think sort of can be debated. So a few critical points to sort of wrap this up before we go over to the Q&A. And the first is obvious, right? Why ethics of ignorance? Why not an ethics of knowledge? Seems to be much better, right? And I find this a strong critical point, and I think it's a good question. But I ultimately think it's wrong. And the reason I think it's wrong is the question of the default. What happens if we do nothing? And I think that if you go back to Heidegger, and you go back to his philosophy of technology, the notion of Gestell and framing, standing reserve, etc., there's something in that essentially seems to say that in the nature of technology, and I'm going to veer on the technological determinism here, so we can debate whether or not that's sort of a fatal flaw in the argument. But the nature of technology is that it reveals. It reveals the forest as wood. It reveals the world as data. And if that's the nature of technology, and that's how technology unfolds, how technological being unfolds over time, then we're going to get knowledge if we do nothing. And you can get at this from another direction, from the technology completion hypothesis or the innovation completion hypothesis. That's essentially a hypothesis that says that anything that can be invented will be invented. If this is true, anything that can be invented will be invented, then all knowledge we can get in W will be had in W. That seems to indicate to me that if we do nothing, we will know. That's actually the default. That's why I think an ethics of knowledge is the wrong way around. I think an ethics of ignorance is actually much better, because ignorance requires an active choice, which is kind of interesting, which used to be the other way around, that knowledge required an active choice. Now, the other critical question that I get from a lot of what I actually think of as my lot of friends is this: does technology really produce knowledge? Is that fair to say? You've talked about all these technological things, and do they really produce knowledge? Is that what they're doing? And it's fair criticism. Not all things that technology can tell you are knowledge. My favorite example is this: the number of people who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat and the marriage rate in Kentucky. They're closely correlated. There is a 0.95% correlation between the two. And I don't know if you've seen this website, but if you haven't, I think the spurious correlations is one of the most, I start my mornings with it because it's brilliant. And what it sort of says is that, well, you've said essentially that the universe W of correlated facts is accessible to us, but sorry, knowledge is something more. It needs to be constructed in another way than just correlated facts. The technology completion hypothesis just states very clearly that you can have all the correlated facts you wish, which means that you can get stuff like this. That's it. Now, Nicholas Nassim Taleb would add to that something that I also think is quite interesting, and that I haven't seen a real mathematical proof for yet, but I intuitively think is probably right. That's this. In large data sets, large deviations are vastly more attributable to noise or variance than to information or signal. The more variables, the more correlations that can show significance. Falsity grows faster than information. So spurious correlation in a data set grows faster than information, which means that if we complete the universe of facts, the universe of information, we will actually it will be costlier to separate knowledge from noise, not cheaper, right? So the knowledge completion hypothesis essentially is saying about the technology, and so that's the sort of second critical point. The third critical point is, and I started from zero, sorry, knowledge is the knowledge completion hypothesis. Says that, well, it's all fine and good to speak about an ethics of ignorance, but it's almost deterministically sure that we will know everything there is because someone will find out the knowledge and then disseminates, and that's what's going to happen. It's essentially denying the premise that we do have a choice when it comes to knowledge at all. That's a critical point I met from some more technically determinist people of a California persuasion, and it's actually quite a hard argument to battle with if you think through it. And another critical point is, how does this relate to forgetting? And we'll talk a little bit about that later, I think. I think that it's a really interesting thing to ask if ignorance is a priori or a posteriori, if it's something that you have before you have knowledge, or if you can actually return to ignorance again by forgetting something. I'm not sure. I'm of two minds there, but I think that you could at least paraphrase Keynes and say, in the long run, we're all ignorant. And that may be true, but there's also a lot of institutional knowledge. And the last critical point that I will give you that I think is really valid is this: it's attention scarcity. We may have the universe of facts accessible to us, but we only have a certain limited amount of attention to direct to it, which means that that attention will be the most important deciding factor in what we know. We still have a scarce resource there. Herbert Simon famously said that the most scarce resource is human attention, final scarce resource, and there are clear biological limits to what we can do. And with that, I'm actually going to suggest we start some questions and answers, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you.